Cuando nos digas, María Paula.
Puede dar inicio, doctor.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Andrés Palacios. I am a principal professor of law at the Faculty of Jurisprudence at Universidad del Rosario. I'm very happy to be here. In this afternoon, for those of you who are watching at the UK, morning time here in Colombia, I have the pleasure to be joined by Eleonora Lozano. She is the Dean of the Faculty of Law at Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. Gira Lopez, which is the Vice Dean of Research here at the Faculty of Jurisprudence at Universidad del Rosario, also in Colombia. With us in this moment is also Anna Chadwick. She's a senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow, also co-editor of this fantastic book that we're launching today. So here it is. Here it is. This is the book that we've been advertising, telling you about. It's a fantastic effort. And we're very happy to be here. So in order to keep our schedule running as smoothly as possible, we're going to jump into the action. And Gira Lopez, who's the Vice Dean of Research, and that is joining us here, she will be presenting the book. Then we will be talking between the co-editors about some of the aspects of the book, like the journey that took us to this day today. Then we will be engaging with some of the co-authors that are here today. And I say hi to both Amber and Jimena Benavides. Good afternoon and good morning to you. And then we'll continue talking with the authors. We'll answer some questions and answers, possibly about new venues of research, new ways of working together. And then if there's any questions about the audience, we'll be very happy to answer them. Feel free to write us on the chat at the YouTube channel that you're watching this. And without further ado, I think we'll begin with Vice Dean Gira. So good morning to you, Vice Dean Gira.
Hi, I want to extend a very warm welcome to Eleonora Lozano, Dean of Los Andes Law School, Anna Chadwick and Javier Solana, who are co-authors and co-editors of the book, and the other authors who are joining us today, to all the attendants and viewers on social media. Today, we are here to celebrate the launch of the book, Markets, Constitutions, and Inequality. This is a very interesting book written by several authors which addresses the different roles that constitutions have in repeating, producing, or curbing economic inequality. It started with an initiative by our very own Andrés Palacios, who is a professor here at the Faculty of Law at the Universidad del Rosario, and his colleagues, Anna Chadwick, Javier Solana, and Eleonora Lozano, the current version of law, to whom we extend a very special greeting. The book proves that to be a challenge to the traditional way we understand constitutions and constitutional law. It is not focused on judicial review, although it addresses it, but instead on the rules and institutions that create or regulate markets and that have become part of the contemporary constitutional landscape. I refer, for example, to the constitutionalization of central banks, of guidelines for regulation, and to certain areas of regulation itself. A comparative perspective suggests that the economy has become a subject of constitutional regulation. So this book brings about very interesting ideas and example of this double movement, the constitutionalization of the economy and the economic analysis of the constitutions. Its chapters address theoretical and specific issues, both of which are useful for the study of constitutional law from a comparative and theoretical perspective. The book also has chapters written by historians and economists, which are very interesting and useful for considering constitutional law outside the narrow borders of its traditional analysis. So we are very happy to participate today in this book launch, and we will now learn about it from the editors and authors themselves. So Andres, thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice Dean, for your kind words. We certainly do hope that this book comes across as a good challenge and as a way of broadening discussions about constitutional law in general. So now I think we should talk about the journey. I think we should talk about how the book came into fruition and the meetings that we've had. So perhaps I would like to give the opportunity to Ana, our co-editor, who's with Javier, who just joined us. Hello, Javier. Good afternoon. So perhaps I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the Glasgow meeting, and then with Eleonora, perhaps Eleonora can tell us about the meeting at Universidad de los Andes.
I think Javier is going to speak to this, so I'll hand over to him, and then maybe I'll come in if there's more to say. I think you're muted, Javier.
Okay, sorry, I was texting Andres saying you need to allow me to unmute, but apologies for being late. I think I'm not the only one who thought the meeting was starting an hour later, and I think it might have been because of the time change in the UK recently, so apologies for being late. Yes, I mean, I'll be more than happy to speak to, I guess, the origins of the project, which indeed started with a workshop that we organized in Glasgow. But I think the origins of the project actually go even further. I believe Ana and Andres had been in touch to share their common interest in exploring the relationship between markets and constitutions. And it was the summer of 2018, which seems really far back now, when Ana and I also struck a conversation about this very issue, partly because I was doing research at the time, looking at the role of central banks and their impact on climate change, but also because we both teach a course at the University of Glasgow called Law and Markets, where we basically try to explore what is the relationship between these two, and constitutions was something that did not feature very prominently in the course, but I guess that because of our research interest, we had both begun to think about what might be the interaction between markets and constitutions. So as a result of these two parallel conversations that Ana was having with Andres and myself, Ana and I put forward an application to an internal fund within the University of Glasgow to get some funding to organize a workshop in Glasgow and another workshop in Bogota in the summer of 2019. I should say that obviously we are very grateful for the funding that we obtained. This was funding provided by the Scottish Research Council in a specific fund called the Global Challenges Research Fund. And indeed, I think part of the an important motivation for us in the project was to also address not just the relationship between markets and constitutions, but also what impact that could have in developing countries, not only because the funding was somewhat conditioned on us looking at that, but because we were generally very interested in this. So there are elements of this in some of the contributions that are in the collection, and I'm sure that this will become relevant once some of our contributors say a few more words about their contributions. But we were successful. We organized a workshop in March 2019. that set the stage. Some of our contributors were there. We also invited some colleagues, some Glasgow colleagues from the economics department, to give us an overview of how economists had begun to think about the relationship between markets and constitutions. And I think that basically set us on a good track to then start to think about our own individual contributions, which we then had the opportunity to present in draft form at the workshop that followed in Bogota in July, I think, of 2019. And I think maybe I can now hand over to Eleonora to tell us a bit about that wonderful workshop that we had in Bogota in July 2019.
Thank you, Javier. Hello to everyone. I'm very happy to be here. For me, it's an honor to present this collective work that I'm so proud of. And yes, we had a great doctoral colloquium. In that moment, I was the PhD in law program director. And we organized in June 26 and 27, 2018, this big conference on economic constitutionalism. We had in that moment, if you remember, 6 panels. The first panel, we discussed the relationship between constitutional law and economic development with the presence of Jorge Gonzalez, who actually is the PhD in law program director, and with Mark Hofstetter, and I was the discussant. And then we had a panel 2, where we discussed the economic constitution around the globe. What do they say? With the participation of Professor Diego Contino, Carlos Herrera, Amber Dar is here, Anna, of course, Chadwick, and the moderator in that moment was Jorge Gonzalez. We had also a panel 3 about economic constitutionalism in practice, where we discussed with here with Jimena Benavides, hi Jimena, about the healthcare problem, the urban property with Carlos Herrera, and with Ronnie Paredes, the agrarian land reform, and the moderator was our professor Juan Amaya. And also we have a panel, a great panel. The moderator was Andres Palacios with all the PhD students, and we discussed about how do they view the economic role of the constitutions. And we had also a panel 5 about the constitutional regulation on economic life around the world with Javier Solana, where he discussed the relation between law and finance, and also with Mohamed Sherin about foreign direct investment. And finally, Andres Palacio also discussed about the competition and public utilities. And finally, we had a panel 6 where we discussed the making of legal and economic consciousness, economic constitutionalism from interdisciplinarity, with the participation of Julia McClure, with Marco Goldoni, Emilos, and Benjamino Caligari, and the moderator was our professor Antonio Barreto. And this collective work that we are presenting today is the result of all those debates, the one that we had in Glasgow, but also the one we had in Bogota. And I'm sure that all these reflections will draw attention and generate debate on the multiple ways law and economics can work together to solve and understand these important issues and questions. So that was our great experience, first in Glasgow, then in Bogota, Andres.
Okay, thank you very much, Javier and Eleonora. It's great to have you here. So I cannot let away this opportunity to ask Anna, because Anna, in the whole process, she was very helpful. And one of the things that Anna always made was that she drafted these incredible pieces for us to comment. And I remember talking with Javier and discussing a lot of questions with Anna. So I cannot let go this opportunity without asking Anna. Anna, in all these conversations that we've had, you've always been very poignant about why do constitutions do not play a more prominent role in discussions about inequality?
I mean, I think really it depends on the literature that one's engaging with. I mean, my perspective has been one that's come from actually, you know, not certainly a constitutional law background, but a law background that's thought about human rights, human rights law. And that pathway took me from thinking about the right to food through to thinking more critically about the market as a means through which food is accessed, and what we need to think about in terms of human rights norms. And how they can perhaps shape market activity in such a way as to realize the right to food in real terms, or how perhaps they might create limits to that. So this was my kind of entry point into the debate. And I was just, you know, very interested that a lot of the work that I started engaging with was literature from legal realism, literature from critical legal studies, and literature from the law and political economy movement in the US, and more recent movements. And I found that there was a lot of focus on private law, and a lot of people writing about markets and perspectives of competition law, international economic law, etc. And somehow in the background of all of those regimes was this big question about the framing role, perhaps that constitutions might play as a background to all of this. But I didn't really find a lot of legal scholarship necessarily that was directly confronting that question. And so this was what opened up my interest in this, although as my own chapter discusses, and as I'll speak about in a moment, legal scholars certainly have moved into the direction of thinking more explicitly about the role of the connection between markets and constitutions in recent years. But I also noted that while legal scholars might not necessarily have elaborated theories, specific theories about how constitutions relate to markets, economists had certainly been intervening in that space. And I don't think Beniamino is with us today, but he has written a fantastic contribution that shows us how economists have been thinking about the relationship between constitutions and markets. And what I started to see from that was how effectively many of the frameworks of governance that I was seeing as a problem and as potential barriers to the realization of the right to food in my earlier work had been elaborated from these ideas in economic theory about how markets work, even about the constitutional significance of markets. So I thought it would be really interesting to think more and engage more legal scholars, but also a broader array of scholars from other disciplines into this, specifically thinking about this connection between markets, constitutions, and inequality.
Well, thank you very much, Ana. If I may, before we talk about your chapter, which right into it, before we get into that, well, I do wanted to make an interesting thing that perhaps we can tie in later with Eleonora, because this is also something that we discuss here a lot in Colombia. So in the Colombian Constitution in 1991, there is a lot of issues addressing the regulation of markets. So for example, for the first time in our constitutional history, we have a central bank as a figure that appears in the Constitution. And actually in Colombia, it's very common to talk about economic constitutional law. We say in Spanish, derecho constitucional económico. And this includes the regulation of public utilities. This includes the regulation of competition law, central bank, and the regulation of financial services and securities. But one of the things that strikes me as very interesting is the idea that while all these aspects are constitutional, they are not political. So central banks are supposed to be far away removed from politics because their independence is a way of ensuring the proper functioning of markets. Competition law is grounded in principles of what we might call today abuse of dominance. The regulation of public utilities, there is an explicit constitutional article that states that what you pay for a public utility must cover the costs of providing the service. So I find it very interesting, this idea that you can have constitutional law without politics. Perhaps I can pick your thoughts on that as we get right into your chapter. A fantastic chapter, by the way.
Thank you, Andres. Well, and this is a good point. So, I mean, this was something that we encountered as a group, especially as a group, scholars coming from the UK and other countries in Europe, and scholars in Latin America and the US, is the great diversity of perspectives and the extent to which some people were coming from constitutional contexts in which the text itself does specifically regulate or have stipulations for the regulation of economic or financial institutions, whereas I was always coming at this question from the point of view of the UK with our infamous unwritten constitution. So trying to understand this huge diversity in terms of how we even think about what a constitution is in terms of its relationships in the market was something that I think animated a lot of our conversations at Glasgow and also in Bogota, just in terms of how differently many of us were approaching the very question of the nature of the constitution in the first place. But I think, yes, so this is how we alighted on the specific concept of constitutional embeddedness, which I think sought to bring out that more political dimension that you were mentioning there, Andres. So perhaps now I'll move into talking about my chapter, which is one of the framing chapters for the book. So we had the idea of setting out a kind of legal perspective on constitutions and the idea of constitutional embeddedness, and juxtaposing it with that of the economists. So the other contribution there would be the piece by Beniamino Calgary. So my chapter essentially engages directly with this idea of constitutional embeddedness. And the title is sort of a play around with that. So the piece is a theoretical contribution that seeks to flesh out and give meaning to the constitutional embeddedness concept. That's one of the framing concepts for the book, and to think about it in a critical register. So the title of the chapter is The Constitutional Disembeddedness of Markets, a Discussion of Competing Accounts. And I begin the chapter by underlining that a lot of contemporary constitutional law scholarship stops shy of advancing an inquiry into these relationships between the operations of markets, constitutional frameworks, and dynamics of wealth distribution. I note that a lot of economists, however, have engaged specifically with the distributive side of constitutions, and that their arguments, such as work on neoclassical thinking on financial market governance and the influence of new institutional economics in shaping prescriptions for development, has been very influential in terms of shaping trends in market governance. And I argue that, albeit at the perspectives of economists that have engaged with the role of law, legality, and in some cases constitutions in directing behavior diverge in important respects, many of them discursively construct and through uptake and implementation by legislators, courts, and expert bodies are seeking to materially influence the operations of law and government over the markets in specific ways, often in ways that might legitimate existing patterns of resource distribution. Hence the interest in bringing out this more political dimension. Okay. So in the chapter, I then move on to reflect on the contributions of a number of legal scholars, because it's clear that in recent years, there's been a lot of advancement in terms of the number of scholars engaging with this relationship. And so I discuss 3 lines of critique that are found in the work of Dixon and Suck, Alvia Garcia, and theories of societal constitutionalism, by which I frame a debate between Gunther Teubener and Emilius Christodoulidis, that are all iterated from the premise that current constitutional structures and the way that they're understood to function in mainstream discourses are either inadequate to their task of addressing inequality, or might actively contribute to the exacerbation of social and economic inequalities. Now, I won't have time to go into the full detail of what I've written in the chapter in this short talk, but what I essentially note is that in many ways, all of these scholars are engaging with this idea of markets somehow being disembedded from constitutional law, but they're all doing it in different ways. And they're all doing it in different ways also because they are all iterated from a different understanding of the Constitution. So for Dixon and Suck, who are engaging with the US Constitution, they understand that as the Constitution as being a clearly demarcated arena of state governance that corresponds to the prescriptions of liberal constitutional theory, and they're looking at the text of the US Constitution, doctrines such as the separation of powers and the rule of law, and constitutional adjudication. So their diagnosis of the disembeddedness problem acknowledges the undue influence that certain constituencies are able to exert within the lawmaking apparatus of the state. And they suggest that the problem is that constitutional practices in the US are in tension with the values of liberal constitutionalism. So they insist on pressing on the antimonies in liberal constitutional theory with regards to its compatibility with persistent and rising inequality. For Alvira Garcia, the Constitution is understood as a broader network of institutions, laws, and practices. And the form of embedding that she is concerned with is the cognitive embeddedness of political and legal actors in a particular ideological framework. She argues that there's nothing inherent in the liberal constitutional form that lends itself to that kind of capture, but her account is essentially looking at a broad conception of the Constitution as being a site for a Polanyian battle to embed or re-embed markets in different societal values and legal frameworks that may better advance or less well advance social welfare. The final scholars that I look at are theorists of societal constitutionalism who argue that constitutionalization is a social process that is only secondarily legal. So Teubner argues that the nature of evolving social systems as communicative discourses and the claim of the Constitution to represent social interests leaves it vulnerable to capture by dominant market logics. On this conception, constitutional forms can create channels through which the only interests that can speak in particular subsystems are those that respond to a commodified logic. And the question is then how to resist this development. So each of the authors that I engage with has a radically different account of the nature of the constitutional form and its relationship to market disembeddedness, yet they all identify and explore solutions to similar challenges, such as the adequate representation of social constituencies in constitutional frameworks and in lawmaking processes, and the importance of foundational structuring concepts of liberal constitutional thought. All of these scholars seek to effectively press on the discontinuities between how constitutional orders are described and how they self-describe and how they actually manifest. So I won't give any more away, rather I'll leave it to anyone who wants to read the chapter to continue to do so. And I'll now hand over to our next author, who I'm guessing would be, who's coming next, because Benjamino, I see, isn't here with us today.
So I think we might go next to Jimena and Eleonora. And basically, we will basically follow the table of contents of the book. The table of contents makes a lot of sense. And one of the interesting things about Anna's chapter, as she was saying, is that it frames a lot of the discussions that we later had. And it's one of the reasons why it's such an interesting thing to have this opportunity to listen to these ideas. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Jimena. Well, first of all, hello, Jimena. I hope you're doing very well. It's great to see you again. Anna was talking at this level of the discussions that people have regarding how constitutional law works and the role of constitutions framing markets. You make a very poignant analysis of the law and political economy of the healthcare in the United States. So it's very situated and it's very particular. I wondered if you could please tell us how do you see your chapter and like the general discussions that it brings and how it ties with what we've been just discussing.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Andres, and thank you everyone, not only for this opportunity to launch the book, but for the whole project and the whole process that this project means. I just want to take a few seconds just to highlight how important this project is in terms of creating collaborative work between scholars from across different disciplines, but most importantly across the global South and the global North. This kind of collaborative work, it's much needed and urgent in to build a powerful discourse that can move, changes, so they can translate research into action and have a more equal world. So I really value this academic effort. So yes, so first of all, before talking about this chapter I wrote, it's important to emphasize that I am a national of Peru, and I have been educated there in Peru, but also in the United States at Yale, and that gives me a particular approach and lens when I talk about the U.S. healthcare system, right, which I am experiencing as a user, and I'm studying as a scholar. Although I am a foreigner. Given that frame, what I'm trying to portray in this chapter is how these developed country, the US, is one of the few countries that does not recognize constitutionally a right to health, right? But formally recognizes an equal protection to all their citizens and whoever lives in the US. And so this formal recognition is very much in tension with the way in which healthcare is provided in the country, right? And some of the main ideas that I want to convey with this chapter is that, of course, every country will have their own way to frame healthcare access, right? It relies on different policy choices, economic, politics, and of course, there are a lot of structural foundations for each healthcare system, which will make them unique, and that will require contextualization of every kind of policy choices. But something that underlines any kind of healthcare system is the recognition that everyone deserves healthcare, access to healthcare, right? And the denial or just keeping or perpetuating barriers to access healthcare is just it's just hard to believe and to keep ossifying in today's world. So I try to go through 3 different examples: drug policy, hospital concentrations, and COVID-19 vaccines production and allocation, and how the U.S. healthcare system has shaped these 3 examples in a way that at the end, healthcare is commodified, right? So whoever has access in terms of money and will have access to healthcare. So at the end, we are marketizing healthcare, and we are missing the point that healthcare systems generally, despite the constitutionalization that every system will give it, should be based on a right to a human rights perspective. That's exactly what the chapter is trying to convey here. Again, it's trying to be more structural. It's not only talking about the US system per se, but more about how these kind of policy choices affect the way we access to healthcare, right? And so it's very important to think in a human rights perspective against to only a very neoliberal or profit-based approach. Another important thing is that through this chapter, I'm trying to frame it around law and political economy and I already mentioned this is a huge movement going in the US. So this has been a practical experiment to apply the LPE thinking into the analysis of the US healthcare system.
Well, Jimena, thank you very much. I don't know if you've heard the news, but apparently Colombia is going to have a very big discussion about its healthcare system. It has been one of the issues that the new government has been discussing for quite some time. So I hope that we have the opportunity to talk about this furthermore in the future. And thank you much for your participation in your fantastic chapter. Well, now I do have the privilege to ask Eleonora Lozano, the Dean of Los Andes School of Law, to tell us a bit of about her chapter. So Eleonora is not only co-author, but she's also co-editor of this book. And she has, when she was involved initially, she was the director of the PhD program, but now she's the Dean of the School of Law. And of course, we're very happy to have a Dean in a book launch. It's not something that happens on a daily basis. So welcome, Eleonora. Thank you for your time here. And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your experience in the project and your chapter.
Thank you, Andres, and thank you, Ana, and Javier also for this great job. The title of my chapter, that is number 4 of the book, is Fiscal Sustainability and its Jurisprudential Evolution, the Fraught Dialogue Between the Economy and the Law. And in this chapter, basically, I analyze how the fiscal rule, which was established in a constitutional reform in Colombia in 2011, embodies a tense dialogue that initiated in the 90s between lawyers and economists here in Colombia. And in that moment, there were several academic scenarios where the fiscal impact was discussed, not only in terms of regulations, but also of judge rulings. Economists in that moment did not understand why judges ended up legislating and dictating public policy in the rulings with very high cost for public finances, while lawyers argued that legal discipline should guarantee the protection of rights without focusing the discussion on economic aspects. Then in the 2011, we have this constitutional reform that gave rise to the need to find a middle ground that will bring about an end to this debate. In other words, that would achieve fiscal sustainability while guaranteeing the effective protection of rights. So what I did in the chapter was basically to test how the constitutional consecration of this fiscal sustainability mandate and the fiscal impact incident and its jurisprudential evolution in Colombia have, even though there are still tensions to be resolved, improved the dialogue between the lawyers and the economists. So I'm very optimistic that this was really done. And the chapter explores 2 main sections. In the first one, I provide a theoretical and a conceptual approach to the fiscal sustainability and the fiscal impact incident and the employ of the constitutional jurisprudence to specify their main characteristics. So this one is very theoretical and basic. And the second one, I explore specific cases of the application of this fiscal sustainability and of this fiscal impact incidents in 4 main fields. The first one, the social security. The second, the victims of the armed conflict. The third, the area of the community mothers. And finally, the field that I feel more comfortable, that is taxes. And well, that was basically the chapter, and I wanted to contribute to those reflections. And I think that here in this field, we will have many other publications, because all of the reforms that we are facing here in Colombia, especially in taxes, and as Andres mentioned, also in the health sector. And so I hope I can help to continue this better dialogue between the lawyers and economists.
Thank you very much, Eleonora. So recently, the government and the Senate approved a major tax reform. I'm guessing you get this question a lot, but perhaps could you tell us, very quickly, what sort of tensions is this recently tax reform going to bring to the Constitution, and to these discussions about how the Colombian Constitution regulates markets through tax?
There is a big constitutional discussion in this moment because the balance is now inclined to the direct taxation, not to the indirect taxation. And the different actors that are in the business sector, they are saying that there's a violation of the equity and also of the not confiscatory principle here in Colombia. So there are going to be a lot of constitutional suits because of this tense dialogue between the efficiency but also the justice in the tax Colombian system.
Okay, so I guess we'll have a lot of interesting economic constitutional discussions in the coming weeks, huh?
Exactly.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Eleonora, and again, thank you very much for joining us today in this event. We appreciate it. I will take this opportunity also to introduce Esteban Izaza and Fernando León, who are actually students, and they're actually PhD candidates at Universidad de los Andes, who've been very involved and been very interested in joining us in this discussion. So both Fernando and Esteban are joining us. Good day to you guys. And you guys are also talking about constitutional law, but you're more interested in the protection of private property. So imagine, this incredible way in which circumstances come together. The new tax reform has been passed, and of course, people in the business sector saying there is a violation of the confiscatory principle in the Constitution. And here we have you two guys which are talking about the constitutional protection of private property. So perhaps you could share with us some of the basic ideas about your chapter and how do you understand this fits like in this ongoing conversation we've been having.
Well, hi, Andres. Hi, everyone. Thank you for sharing this space with us. And first of all, we have to mention that this chapter wasn't be a reality without the work of Julio Montañez, our friend that was out by COVID during the pandemic. So, well, thank you all, even for the note at the beginning of the book. Andres, protecting property, our chapter tries to figure out how neoliberalism has shaped the protection of property here in Colombia. Since the Constitutional Act in 2011 that reshaped the constitutional protection of property frame that allowed that individuals act like prosecutors in property claims, we analyze that as a neoliberal like influence, like privatization, like a privatization effort from designed from the Constitution through the market. So this constitutional act not only tries to, well, I'm sorry, I'm trying to like to find an idea. So this neoliberalism effort not only goes through the market, but also to the protections of property, not only in contracts or judicial acts, but also in the criminal frame. So the chapters, our chapter tries to describe or even describe all those changes and how have that work during 2011 through 2020, when we wrote the chapter.
Okay, yes, Fernando, please.
Yeah, I would like to add some brief thing. I will say that one of the center of the chapter is that the criminal law in general in the Western constitutional civil law tradition is an exclusive public matter. Yeah, I would say that's one of the key for understanding how criminal law works on the continental juridical arrangement. And there are very, very few countries on the Western Europe and Latin America who has this kind of possibility of private persons to activate criminal law. And it is very particular that this kind of reform appeared in Colombia precisely in the times of neoliberalism, because that specific change and how constitutional law addressed the problem of criminal law end up creating, I will say, first creating a specific market for the profession, for lawyers, because they have this new opportunity that they didn't have in the past of activating the criminal law. And that is a huge change on how criminal law protects property on continental law. And second, I will say it changes the distribution of rights on criminal law, because before we introduced that kind of reform, it was like widely known that the idea of an organized knowledge on criminal law and the constitutional rights on criminal matters were used for limitate the possibility of the state of intervening on constitutional rights. But when we give to privates the opportunity of dealing with the criminal protection of law, this balance of rights, I will say, is completely changed. I will close or the idea of our chapter with that small intervention.
Okay, well, thank you very much. But Fernando, I would like to pick a little bit on that. Why is it that giving the opportunity of citizens like direct access to courts and for them to pursue criminal actions against trespassers of their property, why does it affect the balance of rights?
I will say because there was in continental criminal law, there was this assumption in which the conflict itself, like this, any violation of property rights was a public matter. And why it was a public matter? Because property itself was not an object of protection. What was an object of protection in general, I will say it was this idea, this general idea of criminal law that they call bien jurídico in Spanish, that I will say like in English, I don't know the proper translation because they don't have this idea, but I will say it's like the juridical good or I would say the general right to have property, the general right of citizens to have property and not the property itself. So when we give privates the possibility of going to criminal law, we are changing the mere idea of which conflict is protecting. We are not protecting that general idea of property, but the specific property of a person in a particular context. And that changes, I will say, changes all the criminal law, but also changes which rights are in play in a criminal process. Because we are not talking of like these general ideas or general values of a state, but we are talking of the specific ability of a person to use criminal law to protect his own property in specific. And that gives, I will say that gives a very problematic possibility to persons, because once when they previously, when they want to protect their property, they should go to civil law, and they should go to a process that could be long or short, depending on the matter. But criminal law could be used in a very, very severe way, because there is like the threat that you could go to prison, and that could be used for pushing people to restore property and or give some kind of refunding on something. For example, when we talk about a real estate, for example, when we talk about real estate and how a real estate could be face some problem after construction, that used to be a particular civil-like conflict. But right now, with the kind of protection of property that is in Colombia, you could go directly to criminal law and say that was they sold you something that you didn't buy, and that way you could push the real estate constructor for dealing more, I will say, more quick with your problem. So you would have to face a long process in criminal law and in civil law, but just present the action on criminal law to threat people with prison. That would be an example for.
Okay, thank you very much. So if I get it right, it's this idea of using criminal law strategically to pursue what would otherwise be a civil law or a commercial law claim, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Esteban and Fernando. It's great to have you here, and we appreciate a lot your chapter. I think it's very interesting. I would like now to give the opportunity to our own Javier Solana to discuss about his chapter. So I think I need to make a little presentation, Javier, which is the following. Javier has not only been involved in this since day one, he has also worked heavily in the accomplishment of this project. And of course, we're all very happy to have him here. But also Javier is also going to talk about a constitutional dimension that for us lawyers, for example, those of us here in Colombia, are not kind of aware of. And it is this discussion of how things in the European Union can be considered constitutional or not, depending on where you stand, for example, the Treaty of Lisbon, Treaty of Maastricht, and so on. But I also would like to make a little bit of advertising and say, it's very interesting to have Javier here, because he's not just somebody who's joining the conversation, but he's joining the conversation from the perspective of commercial law and financial law. And if you go and check at the University of Glasgow webpage, Javier is also the director of the of the Finance and Social Justice Project, and which of course I think ties very nicely into the kind of ethos of the book. And personally, it's very interesting of the things that you can do here. So sorry, Javier, I had to do that.
No need to apologize. Thank you for that very kind introduction, Andres. And I'm actually glad that you mentioned the Finance and Social Justice Project, because that is a project that stemmed from my original research on climate change and monetary policy. Mm-hmm. And I think it's fair to say that it was in the context of that research that I started to think about the issues that I then tried to explore in the chapter that is now part of the part of the collection. And just maybe to give everyone a little bit of background, in 2016, there was a report from The Guardian, a UK newspaper, that basically brought to light the fact that the European Central Bank was buying assets from companies that operate in very heavily polluting industries. And at the time, I had just arrived in Glasgow, and I thought it was an interesting piece of news. And as a lawyer, I asked myself, well, but surely the European Central Bank has an obligation to protect the environment, right? So it was that very first question that then led me to research what were the obligations of the European Central Bank under EU law to protect the environment. And interestingly, in the context of the corporate sector purchase program, which was the program under which the European Central Bank was buying assets from corporations in industries such as oil and gas, but also the automotive industry and others. So it was that program where I started hearing a lot of arguments from policymakers in the EU saying, we can't really take climate change into consideration because we are bound by market neutrality. And by market neutrality, they basically meant we are bound by an obligation to interfere with markets as little as possible, or perhaps as little as is necessary. And these very common reaction from policymakers in the EU prompted me to ask myself about the constitutional dimension of market efficiency, which is effectively the normative criterion that is driving these remarks. And I thought this was a very interesting question, because when you were talking, Andres, about this notion of the economic constitutional law, it seems to me that ideas of efficiency, which Eleonora also mentioned, and to some extent Esteban also mentioned, I haven't seen any analysis of, what is the constitutional dimension of market efficiency? To what extent are public institutions, and in this case, a monetary authority, bound by the need to pursue market efficiency with their policies? Again, I thought this was very interesting in the specific context of the ECB and its impact on climate change, because it was being used as a defense by the ECB not to do more on climate change. The fact is that things have changed since I wrote that chapter, because now the European Central Bank has changed its stand on monetary policy and its impact on market neutrality. But the debate is still pretty much alive, and is one that is going to continue to be on the covered by the newspapers, because it is something that is being quite controversial, not least because the ECB is one of the first central banks in the world to be taking such proactive steps to address climate change. So to bring all of these back to the chapter, since I had identified a gap in the literature, there was no legal analysis of what was the constitutional dimension of market efficiency, at least in the European Union. I set myself to try and articulate one such analysis, and the conclusion that I reached in the chapter is that the best way of characterizing market efficiency under EU law is by characterizing it as a directive principle. What this means is that the European Central Bank and other EU institutions are bound by this principle, at least when it comes to economic and monetary policy, but that this principle has a programmatic dimension. It sets guidelines to these EU institutions in terms of what they should be aiming to achieve. But it's interesting because the characterization of market efficiency as a directive principle then allows us to understand how it fits within the broader spectrum of normative rules that bind the European Central Bank, which you can apply, an analysis you can apply to other EU institutions. And the interesting conclusion that one reaches is that there are other provisions, like objectives of the central bank, that would trump the principle of market efficiency. So while the European Central Bank may be bound by market efficiency as a guiding principle or a directive principle, other EU provisions, like those laying out the objectives of the ECB, mainly or primarily to maintain price stability, would trump considerations of efficiency. In the chapter, I tried to bring this back to the corporate sector purchase program, and I tried to think about the implications that this legal characterization can have for monetary policy and its impact on climate change. And the conclusion is that if the European Central Bank wanted to change its approach to monetary policy, market efficiency would not be enough to sustain legally, to support such a change of policy. It would have to be grounded in some of its objectives, be them the primary objective of price stability or some of its secondary objectives. So In essence, I think the legal characterization of market efficiency in the context of the EU monetary policy as a directive principle, I think, informs some of the debates that are now taking place about how far can the ECB go in trying to address climate change. And interestingly, this was something that came up in Eleonora's brief presentation of her chapter. It would be interesting to see, with the new change in the approach to monetary policy signaled by the European Central Bank, whether that change of policy is going to lead to any litigation, because we have seen precedents of allegedly affected parties by changes in the monetary policy of the ECB, bringing the ECB to the Court of Justice in Luxembourg to challenge the validity of some of its measures. So I think that this characterization of market efficiency can inform some of those policy debates and will definitely inform any legal action that might be brought before the Court of Justice. And on that final note, maybe I will just mention for the sake of information that the European Central Bank's corporate sector purchase program has actually been challenged before the Court of Justice, and market neutrality, perhaps unsurprisingly, plays a central role in these proceedings. The case was dismissed in first instance. Sorry, the case was not brought before the Court of Justice, apologies, because the case was filed against the Belgian National Bank, which is an agent of the Euro system, effectively. So the case was brought before Belgian courts. The case was dismissed in first instance and has been appealed, and we are yet to hear about the outcome of that appeal. But I think it would be interesting to keep an eye on that case to see what might be the legal implications for market efficiency.
Well, thank you very much, Javier. Let me ask you one question. Now that people are talking so much about ESG, environmental, social, and governance goals, what you're describing is like the forefront of the discussion of how ESG goals play in monetary policy?
I mean, climate change is one very obvious ESG dimension, if you want, of monetary policy. I think it's also important to bear in mind that, at least the way I understand it, ESG is probably something that we would associate with the private industry, with the private sector. When it comes to the public sector, I think we have a much more concrete tools to think about ESG. ESG is something that has been made up, so to speak. But in the public law sphere, we have very concrete provisions in the Constitution that talk about the need to protect the environment, the need to protect human rights. In the case of the EU, we have the EU Charter as well of fundamental rights. There are provisions about reducing inequality, and some of these questions have been asked of the ECB's monetary policy. So perhaps we could say that climate change in that sense is at the forefront of these debates, because it's probably one of the most visible at the moment. But there are many other issues, and I think inequality, interestingly, maybe for the title of our project, is one that has recently attracted a lot of attention, in particular the impact that monetary policy can have on inequality. So maybe climate change is attracting all the attention, but there are many other issues that are definitely worth delving deeper into. Okay,
well, thank you very much. A conversation we'll have pending, Javier, for the next time that we meet. Is there something like a quantitative tightening when the central bank buys like bonds and shares of oil and gas industries, or it's just curious for me as somebody who's a bit naive about central banks in general, but that I think it's very interesting. Well, thank you very much. Now, I also have the pleasure of introducing our own Julia McClure. So Julia has the particularity, I was about to say the advantage, but I didn't want to sound too jaundiced, of the fact that she's a historian. And Julia's chapter is very interesting, and it's very refreshing in the book because it comes across as a chapter of someone who's not a lawyer, but that takes legal issues relating with constitutionalism and with inequity. It takes them seriously. So Julia, thank you very much for joining us here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andres. It's really great to see this intellectually stimulating group back in action. So I'm the director of a global history program here at the University of Glasgow, and I have a course on the global history of inequalities. And so this project in general has been really useful for me, thinking about the role that constitutions and the regulations of markets have played in shaping the historical pathways to global inequality. And I think this project has been really great to participate in because it's showed the benefit of both interdisciplinary and international research, thinking about what questions it is that we need to be asking, as historians and across different disciplines. And it also is a way of bringing different processes into focus. I like the way that Anna summed up the project at the start there, thinking about the embeddedness and disembedding of markets. And this seems to me something that needs revisiting by historians and needing proper rehistoricization. So the material that I presented in this chapter relates in some ways to my current monograph project, which is it's called Empire of Poverty, the Moral Economy of the Spanish Empire. And it looks about, among other things, how particular notions of distributive justice and moral concepts of poverty shape the political economy of the Spanish Empire and the way in which that led to certain imperial inequalities. So the title that I have for this chapter is Rethinking the Historic Models of the Role of Constitutions in Shaping Patterns of Inequality, Iberian Constitutionalism, Common Property and Colonialism. So my contribution to this volume was intended as a critique of the classical liberal economic models that have been behind many historic comparisons of the relationship between constitutions and inequality. So I looked in particular at the models arising from new institutional economics, the likes of Why Nations Fail. So these models have been Anglo-centric and have sought to quantify inequality in relation to the economic growth supposedly caused by constitutions protecting private property. And instead I point to different constitutional traditions, particularly the constitutional tradition that was developed in the Iberian Peninsula in the Middle Ages, so asking us to kind of cast our minds right back in time, but also how these were renegotiated at the start of colonialism in Latin America, which gives us a different framing for thinking about imperial legacies as well, which I think are an important part of thinking about global inequality in a contemporary context. So I point to the way in which the sovereign raised economic capital by mortgaging political capital, and so specifically how the Crown conceded sovereign powers, for example, the power to raise taxation, to finance conquest, and how this led to a more fragmented landscape of sovereignty than has typically been recognised. So in contrast to the liberal constitutional tradition, I explore aspects of the late medieval and early modern constitutional tradition that led to the protection of forms of common property instead of solely individual property, as well as different aspects of the political economy, such as taxation and how this relates to the fragmented landscape of sovereignty. So the chapter concludes by looking at the need to diversify our analytic models in order to recognise different constitutional traditions and their inequality outcomes, but also raises a question that I think we need to think about as a group going forward, about the difficulties of measuring inequalities across diverse value systems.
Okay, Julia, thank you very much. Let me pick one of the topics you mentioned here. For example, in your chapter, you discuss a lot about like the property, what we might call today like the property regime of the Spanish Empire. You talk, for example, about the fueros. How do you think that these institutions have continued over time?
Yeah,
and
I think
impact on the discussions of inequality.
I think, of course, the legacies of this in the kind of modern period is a little bit outside my field of expertise. But I think what's interesting is how it's played out differently across different Latin American countries. And we're developing a project at the moment to compare, for example, Mexico with Argentina and the different sort of traditions that develop in the kind of independence period, and the ways in which these kind of constitutional traditions that come from the Spanish Empire are then kind of transformed in very different ways across different Latin American countries. But I think that if we take Mexico, for example, the ways in which there's been a strong tradition of protecting common property traditions, specifically with the ejido, which was also recognized in the post-independence period, has been significant in the ways in which different indigenous communities have been able to articulate notions of autonomy. So I think that's significant. I also think it's significant that, that there's a reasonable amount of literature on the ways in which inequality actually increase in the independence era with the erosion of some of these kind of traditional spheres of autonomy and communal property regimes that had been existing under Spanish colonialism. So with the kind of rise of the liberal constitution in the modern period. Okay, well, thank you very much, Julia. It's very refreshing to have like the historical analysis about legal institutions from a perspective that is different from like the classic liberal tradition we discuss, and I think it's very interesting. Now, I think that your chapter ties very, very nicely with the last chapter we're going to discuss here today, which is Amber. Amber's chapter. So I'm also very happy to introduce Amber Dar. She's a good friend of mine. She was also a student at UCL at the PhD program where we met. And Amber has been fantastic supporting the project and getting things done. And her chapter is about competition law, which is typically thought of like some issue of technical issue of commercial law, you know, lost between files, smells a bit of mold, but she brings it back to life. And she ties it very nicely with like the historical trajectory of how competition law has perpetuated inequality, and in particular, the role of the East Indian Company. So Amber, fantastic to have you here. Can you please tell us a bit about your chapter?
Yes. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Andres, for organizing this. I just want to say before I talk about the chapter how much I enjoyed being part of this project, working with old friends like you, Andres, and making new ones. I hope I've made some new ones along the way, and really learning a great deal from every single one of you. So thank you very much for including me. My remit for this chapter was really to focus on South Asia and inequality in South Asia and the constitutional, the role of constitutions in inequality. Being a competition law expert, or maybe that's overstating it, but being a competition lawyer, I was tempted to see if I could draw some links between competition law and inequality in the South Asian region. And really the idea of economic constitutionalism helped me explore this area. And really it was a labor of love. It's a topic I've long been curious about, but the sort of the narrow confines of competition law did not really allow me to explore it. So I think this was a wonderful opportunity to sort of break free of sort of that straitjacket of my discipline to move into history. And of course, Julia is the expert, but I dabbled in history a little bit and explored a subject that I'm keenly interested in. So what was my chapter about? I tried to do three things. Firstly, I explored the concept of, you must excuse my voice. I lost it actually a week ago. I lost my voice, but it's slowly coming back, rasping a little still. The first concept I tried to work with the idea of economic constitutionalism to understand really how it operates. And there was, the general conception that the Constitution provides a framework for regulating the economy. And then, of course, the neoliberal conception that actually the Constitution simply facilitates the economy. And it's just a set of rules and the economy is actually superior to it. I was also quite interested in the idea of competition as a constitutional construct rather than, as you very disparagingly relegated it to the dusty old shelves of some, having been a competition PhD yourself, I thought that was quite funny that you did that. But the idea of competition as a constitutional construct, because it addresses the structural aspects of the economy rather than simply the transactional aspects of the economy. So I was quite intrigued by that. So I think in the first sort of section, the main section of the chapter, I worked with the theory of economic constitution as much as I could do in a short chapter, and then link it with the idea of competition as a constitutional construct, and then see how this is reflected in the Indian and Pakistani constitutions. So both these countries in the post-colonial era in which they were created had adopted liberal constitutions, which, despite them having secular and religious overtones, which are often considered to contradict each other, really had adopted liberal constitutions, and in doing that had subscribed to the neoliberal ideas of free trade and private property, which were becoming really important in the post-World War II era internationally. So that was the first part of the chapter. In the second part, I looked at the East India Company, which, if you live in the South Asian region, I think any of the 6 or 7 countries that form South Asia, the East India Company looms large in our imaginations, in our histories, in our thinking processes. And it is widely believed that the East India Company had a very big role in shaping the economic structure of these countries. So my core idea was to see how the East India Company's relationship with countries abroad and was impacting its ability to shape the economies within South Asia. And I was also drawing a parallel between the East India Company and modern multinationals to see if really there were lessons to be learned from the East India Company for the modern multinational. Now, the East India Company had a constitutional role because it was the de facto governing body of what was then British India. But I also argue that in the modern sort of economic constitution, it's not just the domestic constitutional role that matters, but also the international constitution, the global constitution, economic constitution that is created through treaties and bilateral treaties or the multilateral agencies that a lot of these countries subscribe to. And in that, when the modern multinational is embedded in that, it has constitutional powers as well, which allow it to play a very similar role. Finally, I wanted to see whether competition law could possibly respond to the challenges created by the modern multinational. And in doing that, I looked at the traditional model of competition law that we work with, which is the neoliberal, price-based, economic efficiency-focused model of competition law, which is really focused on allocative efficiency, and it's focused on consumers and consumer-facing markets rather than, looking at the supplier end of it. So I was drawn then to the neo-Brandeis school of competition law, which is, I think when I wrote this chapter, was still sort of quite niche, but I think has gained considerable ascendance in the US, particularly where it was, I think it was actually formed, I would say. So the neo-Brandeis school moves away from focusing on price to looking at structures. And it's not adding goals to the competition law as we see it. So it's in fact saying goals are not, the goals of competition law are something to be moved away from, because even price regulation is a goal. And if you bring social justice as a goal, then you're simply substituting goals, and you're making, rather than competition law being this agnostic tool, which it is usually, generally claimed that it is a value-laden tool, and it is doing specific things in the economy, and it's bringing about distortions in doing so. So the neo-Brandeis school then argues that what we should be focusing on is the market structure and how dominant companies or big companies can come in and create inequalities or within economies. So that was really the idea that, I also thought that developing countries would have a better chance at adopting the neo-Brandeis thinking rather than to include social justice goals in their decision making. So really I thought it was quite disparate in some ways. I was trying to bring together quite disparate strands and weave them into a story. But I think the East India Company and the South Asian context allowed me to do that. So it was really a wonderful opportunity. And I think I'm quite keen to explore some of these ideas in my own work going forward, and to really focus on how the buyer power of multinationals or the East India, the buyer power of multinationals, quite similarly to the buyer power of the East India Company several hundred years ago, allows them to, put a downward pressure on suppliers, and in ignoring that downward pressure, we're actually not looking at the markets holistically, and looking at it only from the consumer side is not getting the full picture.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Amber, and we really appreciate the fact that you're joining us here in spite of your health issue. I will not pain you with my questions. I think over the years you've had enough. So thank you very much. So we are running a bit tight on time. So I would like to wrap it up, if it's okay with all of you, in the following way. So I would like to make a couple of very brief comments based on the afterword present in our book, and then perhaps open the mic and give all and each of you the opportunity perhaps to suggest things that venues of research that could be useful, that could be very interesting. Okay, so if you agree, just please nod. Okay, thank you very much. So basically, the afterword is something that we discussed as co-editors, and there's like 2 or 3 very important ideas. So the first important idea is that the idea of having constitutions address markets is a phenomenon that is not single-sided. It's actually a phenomenon that is complex and takes place in different ways. In some circumstances, and I'm thinking, for example, the Mexican Constitution of 1917, the idea of introducing discussions about markets was actually as a way of using the Constitution and the transformative powers of the Constitution to transform and to address some of the social issues that were taking place. And for example, when you see Article 27 about private property and the regulation of private property in that Constitution, and Article 28 regarding the regulation of competition and market-related issues, they are very like self-conscious articles addressing inequality. And in that sense, they're very interesting. But then at the other side of the spectrum, we have constitutions that incorporate market institutions and that address how markets should be regulated, basically as a way of freezing in time certain institutional arrangements. And it's not just freezing in time, but also protecting certain legal and political arrangements from regular political changes. And I think examples of that abound, but for example, the discussion that Eleonora was presenting about fiscal sustainability. This is an amendment that took place in 2011, if I'm not wrong, regarding Article 334 of the Colombian Constitution, basically as a way of protecting established set of institutions from regular political challenges. So here the Constitution is not actually being self-conscious about changing issues that were wrong, but it's actually self-conscious in the sense of protecting a set of institutions for the future. And I think we can see these two polar situations as very interesting, and each one of themselves has a lot of creative power because we can see how these things play out. So for example, in the case of Javier, not properly, I don't know, Javier, correct me if I'm mistaken, but not everybody would agree with the idea of the European Central Bank as being a constitutional institution, right? I mean, people would have issues with that, right? Okay, so, and yet it's an interesting institution because it regulates monetary phenomena in all the member states, or most of the member states actually, in ways that resemble what you would take for granted to be a constitution, but also based in the idea of not addressing certain particular issues and keeping them within narrow borders. So we have these two polar positions that I think are very interesting, and that it just opens the analysis to considering the different ways in which markets, constitutions, and inequality are related. If you add on top of this the historical dimension that Julia was talking about, the way economists see these discussions that is present in Benjamino's chapter, and like the more development of these ideas into like a law and political economy historical landscape, as Amber proposes, well, you have a very interesting mixture of things. So perhaps the first point is that everything is on the table, and we're really beginning to pick some of the really more thoughtful and more deep issues of this connection between these topics. The second idea, which we refer here to in the afterword as further developments, is basically the idea that there are several fields of discussion that do merit further research, and it would be interesting to have the opportunity to discuss with you. So the first one is field theory, as proposed initially by French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, the idea that we start discussing about how the parlance of constitutional law can be used to structure a field of legal action and of legal knowledge in ways that having this parlance can actually further the projects of particular actors or be used as a way of containing particular changes. So I can imagine this in a context in which a savvy constitutional law lawyer can see, for example, a progressive change taking place and is very ably uses constitutional parlance to block these progressive changes that are taking place. It would be very interesting to kind of develop more empirical and grounded research on how knowing constitutional law can be used as a way of furthering or preventing economic changes addressing inequality. The other interesting development that we think should merit further attention is the idea of corporate citizenship. So we're talking about markets and we're talking about inequality and we're talking about constitutions, but there is one sort of legal entity, kind of like a ghost, but at the same time very important, which is the corporation. And corporate citizenship is a concept that has been widely discussed in issues about globalization and issues about markets and how the legal underpinning of markets, but it seems to be that we should discuss further issues about corporate citizenship at the level of constitutional law. There is some very interesting rulings, for example, in American constitutional law about the rights of a corporation. Amber's discussion of East India Company, of how a corporation can be used as a tool for constitutional purposes, is also very interesting. And I think we can work together perhaps to make a very interesting landscape of corporate citizenship, how it fits into the traditional ideas of constitutions and the work this concept actually does in discussions about tax, about private property, about competition, securities, regulation, and other issues. And finally, another issue that I think happens in the cracks, so to say, is the idea of forced migration. So there is a lot of different economies taking place related to forced migration. And forced migration is a social issue of the highest constitutional relevance, but at the same time, it seems like kind of detached of the discussions that we have about the economy and the constitution. So when we talk about, for example, a central bank and how it's a figure that has a prominent place in a constitution, we're not thinking about forced migrants. It is not something we associate easily. And yet, the protection of forced migrants has economic consequences. It has significant consequences for states that assume the obligations to propose these people. But there is also the idea of, these people whose citizenship is a matter of discussion, that participate in different markets and that, for example, further or block economic integration between countries. So I guess this must be a bit perhaps the Colombian bias talking here, but if you think, for example, until recently, the relationship between forced migrants in Venezuela coming into Colombia, the way that these people bring together with them, for example, informal financial services, informal contract arrangements, and informal property arrangements. All of a sudden, these things become constitutionally relevant. So it's a thing that I think it merits further discussion. So I basically want to end with these ideas and perhaps only add up that it has been fantastic, the opportunity of working with my co-editors and my co-authors. Ana and Javier have been really supportive, brought a lot of intelligent discussions. They were there to shoulder the things each one of us like juggling 1,000 things at the same time, but it's really great, and I have to hand it to you guys. You have been fantastic collaborators with this. Your professionalism, your devotion, your knowledge of legal things is really enviable, and I feel very lucky and very grateful to have this published here with my name and yours. So thank you very much for that.
Well, I think we just have to also add a massive thank you to you, Andres, without whom this project wouldn't have been possible. In many ways, you were the sort of inspiration and the starting point for the conversations that we had that developed into those 2 excellent workshops and now this wonderful book. And thank you so much for bringing us all together again on this forum to talk about our chapters. And I very much hope that even though this has been an online conversation, that there will be scope in the future for us all to meet again in person and continue the conversations, perhaps bringing in others as well.
Thank you very much, Anna. But look,
so thank you.
If there's one thing you would like to further your research or your discussions about, what would I be? And I open this discussion to the floor. If there's just one topic you would like to engage further that we discuss in the book, what would it be?
So speaking for myself, something that I don't think we did engage with much in the book is a kind of constitutional conundrum that has been troubling me more recently, which is that in many ways, of course, under the ideals of liberal constitutional democracy, the site of the demos, the site of power should be the people, as expressed through their democratically electing governments, etc. But what I see around, most recently in the context of the UK, in which many of you will be aware, we've had a situation in which financial markets effectively forced changes in interest rate policy upon elected institutions or institutions of finance and monetary policy of the UK government by devaluing the currency and reacting against the mini budget, the infamous mini budget that was issued under Liz Truss's short-lived reign as Prime Minister. And so for me, this constitutional conundrum is that in many ways, what we start to see is that these markets are enacting a form of, they're effectively voting on government policy. And in many ways, when we look deeper to the legal structuring and underpinnings of those markets, what we see are elaborations of rights, property rights and contracts that have in some ways flown the coop in terms of having a transnational quality that means that it is now very difficult for any state to kind of counter these developments. So I suppose a question for my future research is the extent to which we have to now think about economic constitutions, economic, monetary and financial constitutions as being transnational in character.
Wow, that's a big one. Yeah, that's certainly a big one. Thank you very much, Anna.
Can I just quickly add to that and say, Anna, that really resonates with me because when I wrote this chapter, I was thinking of transnational supply chains, but wasn't able to articulate it as much in the chapter as I think I'm understanding now. So that absolutely resonates to me. And I think that, this notion that countries are sort of independent to chart their own trajectories and futures is really, maybe idealistic, if not entirely inaccurate. So I think that really resonates with me. And I think you've said it extremely well, but I think I could definitely get behind that.
Okay, thank you very much. So things cooking up. Okay, Jimena, yes, I would like to pick your brain on that.
Yeah, I think I will add to think loudly about collaboration. So something that has been, we started this project before the pandemic, right? But through the pandemic, there has been a huge continuation of a wave that started definitely before about collaboration, harmonization. And I would raise the question of who is behind, or who are the institutions and countries behind this push, and also how can we frame this push within the economic constitutionalism that we have framed through this project, right? Who is harmonization harming, or favoring, and to what extent we are creating a national, regional, international collaboration, or probably a international constitutional order without recognizing it, positively.
I can see that, and in particular in your field of health law. I was thinking about the possibility that, well, there's this like insurance-based model of healthcare that has become very globally diffused. And there's always a possibility that somebody comes up to one institution and says, well, look, I'm not a citizen of this country, but I have a contract in any other country with this corporation, so I demand the fulfillment of the contract here. That would be an interesting discussion.
Yeah, that definitely happened with health insurance, as you mentioned, and also with access to medicines, right? I mean, track not only production, but going a step back, research and development and innovation of new medicines, right? And we saw that with the production of COVID-19 vaccines. So yeah, that will be, I think, something that it's worth paying attention to and questioning, having a critical conversation about these kind of issues.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jimena. It definitely sounds very promising. I'll be interested in that. Now, what about you, Fernando?
Well, I'm moving in another kind of things, but while I was writing the chapter with Esteban and Julio, two things got my attention. And the first one was that in 2011, when the constitutional act was, or constitutional reform was being done, there were a lot of companies that were pushing the constitutional reform. But after the constitutional reform, these same companies did not use the criminal private action. Mm-hmm. And that is very, very particular, because why they pushed so hard the constitutional reform if they didn't have any interest on doing this use in everyday practices. That was the first thing. And the second thing, I will say this is a very underdeveloped line of research, but that has some small papers in some parts of criminal law, is the relationship between criminal law arrangement and private investment. And I would like to see if this constitutional reform, the possibility of private companies and persons to go directly to criminal law, has affected in some way the attraction of private investment to Colombia, because it might be one of those neoliberal kind of things that are not really used by companies, but play some role on how they distribute their resources.
Okay, thank you very much, Fernando. We should definitely talk more about that, because as a professor of contracts, I have some similar questions to that. My students come with the questions all the time of to what extent a breach of contract can actually amount to something that brings about criminal liability and all this stuff. Well, thank you very much. Julia, what about you?
Yeah, thank you for this question. So I'm, as a global historian, I'm sort of very interested in the transnational dimension that Anna and Amber have both mentioned here. Why do we focus on constitutions in the state in the context of today's kind of global flow of capital and the way that kind of capital is institutionalized? I think raises kind of interesting questions, and I suppose that speaks to your work, Andres, in terms of contract law, and I guess Pista, her work on law and capital has looked at the ways in which this kind of the world of private law is kind of like regulating capital beyond the state and so on, that kind of gets to this transnational dimension, and how does constitutionalism fit back in that picture? But I think with my historian's hat on, I'm interested in different processes of constitutionalizing. So I kind of wanted to point to the plurality of this within my own chapter, but I didn't have a chance to think about the the worlds in which the kind of 16th century colonialism was confronting, which was actually a landscape of alternative processes of constitutionalizing, some of which were erased, some of which were metabolized. And I think kind of that's significant for thinking about kind of the thinking beyond the state effectively in terms of, how autonomy is kind of created, and this kind of decolonial approaches to kind of the process of constitutionalizing.
Okay, thank you very much. Javier, before we continue with you, I would like to present to you a question that has been presented here on via YouTube, if that's okay. So it says, my question has to do with our ongoing global developments, COVID, war, climate change, etc., which emphasize the need for global solidarity. Is there anything that you can say about this from your perspectives, about how these developments interact with global solidarity and what we can say about them? Javier, perhaps you would like to address some of those issues?
Yes, maybe. I mean, what comes to mind when I think about this in the context of monetary policy is, again, is the need to rethink how we had assumed that monetary policy and central banks should operate, like this idea that market efficiency and allocating resources efficiently was driving a lot of the policy decisions, I think has been challenged by some of the developments that we've seen, certainly on the climate space, but now more recently with the situation in Ukraine and other social issues. So I think these just raise interesting questions about, how do we balance ideal objectives of effective distribution of resources with, what we have to live with, which is uncertainty, instability, wars at our doors, impending climate disasters. So I think it just raises many interesting questions about how do these fit, for example, within central banks' mandates, and our constitutions, which design these mandates, well suited to make room for these considerations. So how adaptable are they? These are just some of the things that come to mind. But maybe if I can just take the opportunity to comment on, future research focus that we could have. It actually kind of builds on this idea, because I think that what many of my co-authors have said hint at an idea of powerlessness, and that constitutions maybe are just not what we thought they would be in terms of protecting this realm of autonomy and carving a way forward for states, planning where they wanted to head, and some of the things that have been raised seem to question this. And so maybe to offer a counterpoint to that, I think it would be very interesting for us to think about ways, and to do that critically, to think about ways in which constitutions could empower to counter some of these forces that we're seeing, including the ones that this person on the chat mentioned. So to what extent they could be tools for proactive action, and maybe to give a counterpoint to the perception that constitutions leave us powerless. So I'll stop there. I'm sure others want to jump in too.
Well, thank you very much, Javier. That's a lot to think about. Thank you very much. So as you were talking this question, I thought, for example, one thing that ties most of the stuff that we've been just discussing is this idea that at a global level, we should think the effect of constitutions globally. But perhaps we should also narrow down what sort of effects we're interested in. One of them, for example, would be the way in which capital is also global and to some extent disembedded from particular constitutions. So if you think, for example, of foreign investment in healthcare sectors, most likely you will find that there's a couple of corporations that dominate the landscape globally at the different levels of the provision of healthcare services, including medicines. And Jimena, if I'm too wrong, just say don't, Andres. but I would imagine things like that to be so. And the fact that like global order implies or allows for disembedding these particular economic issues from local constitutions, it invites, of course, a question about global solidarity. Because just as there is a global accumulation of capital, what happens to the other side? Is there something like the expression or the strengthening of global solidarity? And we can certainly find networks, global networks of people using constitutions strategically for the right. So, for example, there's a lot of pro-abortion networks bent on this idea, but it doesn't seem to work as organized and as neatly as the global organization of capital in different sectors. So it might be interesting actually to find out why is there like discrepancy. But again, very, very interesting, lot to think about. Well, I think this brings our little chat to an end. I am really, really happy to be with you here today, in spite of the fact that we're not really here, but it's really great to see all of you and to talk to all of you and to listen. It's fantastic to have this collective work together. I am very grateful to all of you and very happy to have this opportunity of talking to you and making these questions and everything. So I think that without further ado, this is a goodbye. I hope to talk with you guys later. Let's talk about these projects and how perhaps we can work. Since now I'm formally at a university, I think I have more resources that I can bring to the table, and I think that could be useful. So thank you very much for you being here. A special thanks to Universidad del Rosario and to Universidad de los Andes for help organizing this, and it's great to see you guys. So goodbye.